I am Natalie, 34, and my wedding turned into a nightmare when my own sister ripped the wig from my head in front of 200 guests, their whispers cutting deeper than any knife. But minutes later, the man I was about to marry silenced the entire hall when he shaved his own head to stand with me, proving that love can turn humiliation into strength. The mirror caught me in a way I almost didn't recognize. I stood in ivory lace eyes lined with nerves and determination. Maggie knelt at my side, tugging gently at the hem of the gown, muttering that it would behave this time. Lily squeezed my hand so tightly her knuckles were white. I bent down, kissed her forehead, told her she was perfect. She nodded but kept glancing toward the double doors where music was beginning to swell. I touched the curls that framed my face, the wig that had replaced what illness had stolen. It was no longer disguise but armor-proof that I had come back when no one thought I would. 2 years earlier, doctors had spoken in clipped tones about survival rates. Today, I was breathing, standing in silk, holding my daughter's hand. The weight of that victory should have lifted me, but it didn't. Behind those doors, my parents were waiting. I could picture my mother Eleanor arranging her pearl necklace, my father Charles standing tall with the same look of quiet dismissal he always reserved for me. Their pride was for Amanda, their younger daughter, never for me. I had grown up learning to watch her praised for mediocrity, while my own achievements were brushed aside as expected. Even now on my wedding day, I caught them beaming at her in the front row, as if she were the one walking the aisle. Jason Hall, a colleague from the Community Health Foundation, was somewhere in the crowd. When I risked a glance through the curtain, I found his eyes. He gave a small nod, the kind that told me to steady myself. "You don't need their permission to matter," he once said. His silent encouragement held me upright as the coordinator motioned that it was time. The doors opened, and the quartet began to play. Lily stepped out first, her little shoulders squared with courage petals trembling in her basket. I followed Vale, brushing against the polished floor, the light from the tall windows scattering across the hall. For a moment the scene blurred into color and sound, but then I saw them. Mom's lips curved into a thin smile, directed at Amanda, not me. Dad raised his hand slightly in greeting, then turned back to speak to a relative, as if I were a passing acquaintance. The sting burned hotter than the lights overhead. Maggie whispered from behind me that I looked radiant. I lifted my chin, forced my steps to remain measured, one heel after the other. The guests leaned in, phones hovering, a sea of expectant faces. Yet there in the second row were empty chairs marked reserved with crisp white cards. My family had promised to fill them. They sat vacant, a row of silent accusations no bouquet could soften. Jason's gaze caught me again, urging me forward. I reached the altar and steadied the bouquet between my palms. The officiant's voice rose calm and practiced. I tried to let the rhythm of the words settle me. My heart, though, pounded with a strange certainty. Something was out of place. I glanced once more toward my parents. Eleanor leaned close to Amanda, whispering quickly, before pressing her hand with a look that was both triumphant and secretive. Amanda smirked, her eyes darting toward me for only a second, then away, as if she already knew something I did not. The music softened. The vows began, and the world seemed to tilt. My breath snagged behind the veil. On the surface, everything gleamed perfect, yet I felt the crack forming beneath it, thin but ready to split. I knew this day was not going to end the way I had dreamed, and as I tightened my grip on the bouquet, I braced for the moment when the storm waiting outside those doors would break through and claim my wedding. My mother leaned toward me, her perfume sharp with roses and wine. "This is Amanda's day, do not make a scene." The words sliced through the music, cold and deliberate, leaving me clutching the bouquet harder than before. A memory struck without mercy. Winter 2016. The hospital windows frosted my grandmother's hand, frail but warm in mine. She whispered promises of the Vermont cabin, the place where summer smelled of pine and honey, where she told me it would be mine when she was gone. At the reading of her will, the truth unraveled. Every page named Amanda. My voice had no place. My parents called it practical, said I would manage fine on my own. I had walked out with snow in my shoes and silence in my throat, carrying Lily on my hip, while Amanda accepted congratulations. That wound had healed poorly, and now the scar split wide open. The officiant's words carried on steady and practiced, but my focus fractured. Amanda glided past the rose sequins catching light, her smile practiced like a photograph. She bent close enough for only me. "Tonight, you will remember forever." The venom in her whisper sent a chill racing across my shoulders. She lingered long enough for me to see the gleam in her eyes, then settled back in her chair, as if nothing had happened. I forced myself to breathe, but the hall felt tighter. The string quartet softened. Guests leaned forward. Phones rose in eager hands. Across the aisle, 2 seats marked reserved sat empty, the white cards untouched. They had been promised to family who chose Amanda instead. The emptiness glared louder than applause. My father shifted in his chair and cleared his throat at the moment the officiant asked if there were objections. A ripple of laughter spread among the guests, but I caught Amanda's quick glance toward him, the curve of her lips hinting at private agreement. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron. Maggie's eyes searched mine from the second row, her face a quiet warning. She mouthed breathe. I tried, but each inhale felt brittle. Lily sat perfectly still, bouquet of petals trembling in her lap, her eyes darting nervously between Amanda and me, as if she sensed something brewing that no one dared name. The vows began. My fiancé's voice was steady, filled with warmth and certainty, pulling me back to the moment we had built together. When it was my turn, my throat tightened, but I found strength in his gaze. For a breath, hope pressed against the walls of fear. Then a murmur spread along the back rows. Guests craned their necks. A late arrival. A misplaced whisper. The officiant hesitated, his page fluttering between his fingers. My mother's posture stiffened, Amanda's chin lifted, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. The ceremony pressed on words floating, but my pulse drowned them out. Every detail of the hall sharpened the flicker of candles, the sway of flowers, the faint scrape of a chair leg dragged where it should not move. The air thickened as if waiting. I passed my bouquet to Lily, my fingers brushing hers. She looked up, lips parted as though about to speak, but she said nothing. Her wide eyes mirrored what I already knew. The officiant turned another page, the sound crisp in the silence, and it struck me like a signal. Something was coming, and when it landed, it would tear this day apart. Amanda rose from her seat with a suddenness that pulled every gaze. Her heels clicked against the floor. As she closed the space between us, her eyes locked on mine with a glint I recognized from childhood quarrels. But sharper now, dangerous. Before I could step back, her hand shot out and wrenched the wig from my head. Gasps rippled through the hall, followed by a swell of whispers and a few muffled laughs. Phones lifted instantly, screens glowing as lenses captured the moment. Cold air struck my scalp and my chest hollowed, as if all the breath had been stripped from me. Amanda held the wig high like a trophy, her smirk wide. "Telling lies with hair will not make you beautiful," she sneered. For a heartbeat, I stood frozen, the sting of humiliation louder than the quartet that had stumbled into silence. My hands trembled against the lace of my gown. I saw Lily's small face in the front row, her mouth open in shock, her fingers clutching the fabric of her dress until her knuckles whitened. Maggie rushed forward, wrapping her arms around me, angling her body to shield mine from the sea of stares. My mother's voice cut through the air, flat and cool. "Do not ruin this day." Her pearls caught the light as she turned away, her lips pressed thin. My father refused to meet my eyes, his hands buried deep in his pockets. The betrayal of their silence burned hotter than Amanda's words. Dr. Karen Brooks, a colleague from the hospital, pushed her chair back with authority. Her voice rang clear. "This is assault." The firmness in her tone quieted some of the laughter, though cameras still hovered, capturing my bare head as if it were spectacle. Jason shifted near the aisle, his phone in hand. My screen buzzed a moment later, inside my clutch. "If you need me, I will testify," his message read. I lifted my eyes toward him and found his steady gaze unwavering in a room that felt suddenly hostile. Amanda dropped the wig onto the floor beside me, as though discarding trash. A murmur spread through the crowd, the low hum of judgment and gossip thick enough to choke. I bent slightly not to retrieve it, but to steady myself. Maggie pressed a hand to my back, whispering that I did not have to endure this alone. I heard someone snicker behind me, then another voice hiss, "Hush!" But it was too late. The shame prickled across my skin. The lace sleeves of my gown felt like chains binding me in place under the scrutiny of 200 eyes. Lily broke from her seat and ran to me, clutching at my skirt. Her little voice cracked, begging me not to cry. I knelt enough to hold her, my arms circling her trembling shoulders. My tears threatened, but I willed them still, unwilling to give Amanda more. The officiant cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably with his script half raised. The ceremony was suspended in limbo, each second stretching long and cruel. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing on me, demanding a choice. I straightened slowly, Lily's hand still in mine, Maggie bracing my other arm. The wig lay at my feet, silent evidence of Amanda's cruelty. Around me, the room buzzed with the restless energy of scandal. My mother adjusted her necklace, refusing to look. My father's jaw tightened. Amanda's smirk lingered like poison. Every instinct told me to run, to flee the suffocating air of the lodge ballroom. But another part of me, deeper and fiercer, told me to stand. This was not only about me. It was about Lily, watching her mother, about every quiet dismissal I had swallowed, about dignity stripped bare in front of strangers. I drew one steady breath. And as the room waited, restless and hungry for the next move, I knew the silence would not last. Something inside me was about to break, or it was about to speak. Maggie gripped my arm and steered me away from the stairs, pushing through the side door into the preparation room, where the air was quieter, but heavy with my own heartbeat. She pulled a soft shawl from a hanger and draped it over my bare head, her hands gentle, as if she were covering a wound. Lily stumbled in after us, her sobs ragged, clinging to my gown. I knelt down, pulling her into my arms. Her tears dampened the lace as I whispered that it would be all right, though my own throat burned. The door opened again this time, revealing Cole Harper, the venue manager. His usually polished composure was shadowed by concern. He carried a clipboard and a tablet, his voice steady. "All cameras in the main hall are active," he said. "The footage is secure. I am filing an incident report immediately." His words steadied me in a way nothing else had since Amanda's attack. Karen Brooks appeared next, her medical badge still clipped to her blazer. Her tone was firm as she took the pen from Cole and signed the report as a witness. "This is documented," she said, her eyes meeting mine with steel. Jason slipped into the room quietly, his phone glowing. "I sent an email with the timestamp screenshots attached. It is already archived." He slid his phone back into his pocket, his expression calm but intent. My hands trembled as Cole passed me the form. The lines blurred through my watery vision, but I forced the pen steady enough to scrawl my name. I added beneath it, in sharp strokes, "This is not a joke." My signature felt like a wall finally built. The papers stacked together, weightier than they looked, proof I would no longer be erased. The door creaked again. My mother stepped in, pearls gleaming against her navy dress. Her face was composed, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room, the papers, the witnesses. She closed the door behind her and her voice dropped low. "Enough of this. You will not embarrass us further. Let it go for the sake of family." I rose. Lily still pressed against my side. My mother's words wrapped tight around the same noose I had felt all my life. Protect the image. Silence the pain. Keep the spotlight polished for Amanda. Maggie stood straighter. Karen crossed her arms. Jason watched carefully, but I did not wait for their support. "No," I said, my voice clear and louder than I expected. "Everything is already recorded." Her lips parted in shock, as if I had spoken blasphemy in a sacred hall. I repeated myself, steadier this time. "It is documented, and it will not disappear." For a moment she faltered, her hand tightening on the strap of her clutch. Her expression flickered with something between anger and fear. She glanced at the stack of forms on Cole's clipboard, then at Jason, whose calm gaze dared her to push further. She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, the weight of the evidence settling heavier than her control. I held Lily closer, her small heartbeat pressing against mine. My own pulse slowed as a strange certainty replaced the shame. This was no longer about surviving humiliation. It was about refusing to surrender it to silence. My mother adjusted her necklace with a snap of defiance, her mask slipping back into place. "We will talk about this later," she muttered, before slipping out as quickly as she had come. The door shut behind her, leaving the room thick with the echo of her failed command. I lowered myself into the chair by the vanity, my reflection raw beneath the shawl. The papers rested on the counter beside me, signatures stark and undeniable. For the first time that day, I felt the weight of control shift. But even as I exhaled, the muffled stir of voices seeped in from the ballroom. The ceremony had not ended, and neither had Amanda. The proof was mine now, but I knew the next move would not come from me. It would come from her. I stepped back into the ballroom, the murmur of voices rising like waves against the walls. The chandeliers glared down with merciless brightness, catching every eye that turned toward me. My father stood near the front row, his jaw tight, his hand raised as if he could command the chaos. "Handle this later," he ordered, his voice clipped heavy with expectation. Amanda's laugh rang sharp, false, and airy. "I was only joking," she said, shrugging like a child caught with sticky fingers. The wig lay crumpled near the aisle, her smirk daring me to let it go. Something in me cracked wider. The memory of my grandmother's will flared again, her promises twisted and rewritten, until Amanda's name shone where mine should have been. That day, I had swallowed silence, too tired to fight the tide. But tonight I saw it clearly, a pattern carved over years. My family had never been fair, not once. Jason moved to my side, his presence steady. His voice carried through the crowd, firm and controlled. "This is not a small matter. What happened here is a violation, and it was witnessed by every person in this room." His words landed like a gavel, silencing even the snickers in the back. Guests shifted their whispers, no longer private. A woman near the aisle leaned toward her husband. "This family is toxic," she murmured, and though she meant to keep it low, the words spread quickly, feeding the tension. Some guests nodded. Others stared at the floor as if afraid to be seen choosing sides. I straightened my back, the shawl slipping slightly, but I did not adjust it. My voice came out louder than I expected, carrying to every corner of the hall. "You want silence. You want me to bow my head like always. But I will not. Not tonight." The room stilled, then fractured. A few guests clapped softly, uncertain but supportive. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to be drawn into the storm. My father's face reddened, his mouth pressed into a hard line. My mother sat stiff, her pearls unmoving, her gaze pinned to the floor. Amanda stepped forward, her hand on her hip, feigning wounded innocence. "You are making a scene," she said sweetly, but her eyes glittered with triumph. "This is supposed to be your wedding, not a courtroom." I met her gaze and felt the years of dismissal harden into something unshakable. "This is my wedding," I answered, "and my life. You stripped both in front of everyone." The officiant looked helpless, his script drooping in his hand. The string quartet had fallen silent long ago. Every eye turned between us, as if watching a verdict unfold. The air vibrated with judgment, and I felt the scales tip, some toward me, some away. Maggie's hand brushed my elbow, grounding me. Lily clung to my gown, her wide eyes following every word. For her, for myself, I would not retreat. The division spread like fire. Some guests crossed their arms, muttering that families should solve things privately. Others shook their heads, their expressions carved with respect. My humiliation had spilled past bloodlines. It now lived in public, undeniable. I stood tall in the center of the ballroom, no longer hidden behind lace or silence. The choice had been made. This was no longer a private wound whispered away behind closed doors. It was a fracture laid bare for the world to witness. And as Amanda's smirk returned sharper than ever, I knew she was far from finished. Whatever came next would not be whispered. It would be war. David stepped forward from the edge of the aisle, his face calm, but his jaw set with quiet fury. The murmur of the crowd dimmed as he reached me, sliding his hand into mine. His grip was warm, firm, unshakable. His voice carried through the hall, each word deliberate. "No one has the right to humiliate my wife." The weight of his declaration fell over the guests like a heavy curtain. A silence stretched raw and thick. David guided me gently away from the center, leading me toward the side hall, where the groomsmen had gathered earlier. I felt every eye following us, the press of whispers held back by shock. Inside the groom's room, the air smelled faintly of cologne and fresh starch. David motioned to a staff member standing uncertain by the wall. "Do you have clippers?" The young man blinked, but nodded quickly, disappearing for a moment before returning with a set of electric trimmers. David accepted them without hesitation. I reached for his arm, my voice breaking. "You don't need to do this." His eyes met mine, steady and resolute. "Yes, I do." With a single click, the hum of the blades filled the small room. He pulled off his jacket, set it neatly aside, and ran the buzzing clippers across his hair. Dark strands fell in uneven clumps to the floor. His reflection in the mirror transformed with each pass until his scalp shone bare, raw, and fearless. My throat tightened. He was stripping himself of the very thing Amanda had tried to use against me. When he turned off the trimmers, the silence roared louder than the machine ever had. He wiped his hands clean, lifted his chin, and offered me his arm. "Ready." Together, we stepped back into the ballroom. Conversations stuttered into silence the moment we appeared. The chandeliers glittered above, but all light seemed to gather on him. Standing tall at my side, his head newly bare. He tightened his hold on my hand, and when he spoke again, his voice rang against every wall. "If hair is something to mock, then we carry it together." The words dropped like stones into water, rippling through the crowd. No one laughed. No one whispered. Some hands flew to mouths, others clasped together tightly. I saw tears glisten in the eyes of strangers, of colleagues, even of a few distant relatives who had always looked away. Amanda froze in her place, her lips parting but no sound escaping. The color drained from her face, her smirk wiped clean. She looked smaller, suddenly a shadow shrinking against the brilliance of what stood before her. Jason's expression softened. Maggie's eyes brimmed. Karen nodded firmly as though affirming that justice had found its stage. Lily pressed closer to my gown, her eyes wide but calmer now, wonder replacing fear. The hall felt suspended, every guest bowed beneath a moment larger than shame or pride. It was love stripped of ornament, bare as the man who held me in his arms. Yet even as silence hung reverent and heavy, I sensed it was not the end. Amanda's hands clenched at her sides, her chest rising with quick, shallow breaths. Whatever mask had cracked in front of 200 witnesses, I knew she would not let it stay broken. And in that fragile pause, while David's courage still lit the room, I braced myself. The battle was not over. The next strike would come soon, and it would cut deeper. The shift in the room was almost visible, like a current turning beneath the surface. Conversations that once circled Amanda now died before reaching her. Guests who had crowded for her attention stepped back, eyes down, unwilling to be associated with what she had done. When the photographer raised his camera near the head table, Amanda tried to angle herself into the frame, but no one moved closer. The lens tilted away, capturing David and me instead. Cole Harper slipped into the aisle, his phone in hand. He nodded at me before tapping his screen. Moments later, my device buzzed. The email was there, the official incident report time-stamped and signed copies sent directly to Jason and Karen. It was more than paper now. It was record unshakable. A woman I barely knew from my mother's church approached quietly. Her eyes were wet. "I'm sorry," she whispered for laughing earlier. Others followed, voices hushed, apologies falling like uneasy confessions. Their shame softened something in me, though it could not erase what had been done. Amanda sat stiff at the end of the bridal table, her hands clenched around the edge of her chair. I caught the faint buzz of her phone, the glow of a screen lighting her face pale. She glanced down, her lips parting, and I knew the message struck hard. Later, I would learn it came from the man she had hidden from everyone, a fiancé who decided distance was safer than scandal. His words were final. "It is over." The isolation pressed in fast. My father tried to speak with a booming tone, insisting Amanda had meant nothing, that the family should not be judged by a single moment. My mother knotted pearls trembling at her throat, trying to smooth the shame with excuses. But no one listened. Guests turned away conversation, shifting to anything else, leaving them stranded in their own defense. Amanda's eyes darted from face to face, searching for an ally. None met her gaze. When she rose, her legs shook, the satin of her dress trembling with each unsteady step. Tears streaked her makeup, dark lines tracing the face she had guarded so fiercely. Her sob broke the silence, raw and guttural, before she fled down the aisle, her heels slipping against the polished floor. The doors closed behind her, the echo swallowing the last of her defiance. What remained was not triumph for me, but a deep exhale I had carried for years. The weight slid from my shoulders, leaving something lighter, quieter. It was not joy, not revenge. It was relief. Justice had unfolded on its own stage. David's hand remained firm in mine, his bare head gleaming under the lights. Maggie brushed a tear from her cheek. Karen's eyes softened, and Jason's small nod told me I had not imagined the tide turning. The orchestra sat frozen with their instruments, waiting for direction. The officiant glanced at me nervously, unsure if the ceremony could continue. Guests shifted in their seats, the hum of uncertainty building again. I drew a breath, feeling Lily's hand slip into mine. Her eyes were calmer now, braver. I knew the storm had passed, but another choice stood ahead. The question lingered heavy in the air. Would the wedding go on, or had it already been rewritten into something else? The officiant cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the book again. The hall waited, still fragile from what had just unfolded. David squeezed my hand, his bare head gleaming under the chandeliers, his eyes steady on mine. I nodded once, and with that simple gesture, the ceremony continued. The words of the vows felt heavier than they had in rehearsal, not scripted promises, but truths carved by fire. Guests leaned forward, not to gossip, but to witness. When David spoke, his voice carried with conviction, and when it was my turn, my voice did not waver. I felt every word plant deep into the ground beneath us. When the officiant finally pronounced us husband and wife, the applause was not loud at first, but warm, genuine. It built slowly until the entire room was standing, not because tradition required it, but because respect had replaced spectacle. For the first time that day, I felt seen not as someone to be judged, but as someone to be honored. Cole Harper approached us quietly as the guests began to shift toward the reception. He placed a sealed envelope in my hand. Inside was the certified copy of the incident report, his signature beneath Karen's and mine. "It is safe now," he said firmly. Jason stepped closer, offering a discreet nod. "If you pursue this legally, I am ready." His calm confidence steadied me further. I tucked the envelope into my clutch, feeling its weight not as burden, but as shield. My parents lingered near the edge of the room, their faces pale. My mother reached out once, her voice low, asking if we could pretend it never happened. My father muttered about keeping appearances. I stood tall, David's hand in mine, and answered with clarity. "For now, we need distance. I will protect my family, even if it means silence between us." They said nothing more. Their shoulders sank as if the foundation beneath them had shifted, and for the first time in my life, I was not the one retreating. The rest of the evening carried on differently. Conversations shifted toward admiration rather than scandal. Some guests approached with tears in their eyes, thanking David for what he had done. Others patted Lily's shoulder, telling her how brave her mother had been. My daughter smiled shyly, holding tighter to my hand. I knew she would remember not the humiliation, but the strength that followed. When it was time to leave David and I walked together through the tall doors, the night air cool against our faces, I lifted my chin not with defiance, but with pride. No shame clung to me anymore, only the quiet certainty that we had endured and risen. As we stepped into the waiting car, I looked back once at the lodge glowing behind us. That place had tried to strip me bare, but it had also witnessed something greater. The cruelty had not won. Love had. If you had been in my place, would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood to defend your dignity? Tell me what you would have done, and let us keep this conversation alive together.